So good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure, but also a great honor for me to open this session and to introduce Professor Jay Barney as a keynote speaker. Within SEAD, which we warmly thank, EURAM created the Penrose Award last year, and Jay is the first awardee of the prize. I think that was the best choice the award committee could make, because for all of us as a community, whose ambition is to build a science of management, Jay Barney's research is decisive. The theory of the firm has long been dominated by economics, the economics of transaction costs, the industrial economics with its structure, conduct, performance scheme. And with the resource-based view, Jay Barney formulated a managerial and no longer economic theory of the firm. Jay Barney has contributed to giving management as a discipline its own intellectual and scientific basis. And the Penrose Prize intends to reward path-breaking management research. One cannot dream of a more path-breaking research for management than that led by Jay Barney. His resource-based view, a new theory among others of the firm and therefore of management, I think it's more than that, and personally, I particularly like the idea of view in resource-based view. I'm a great reader of Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein distinguishes the notions of theory, of concept, and of what he calls seeing as. And we all know that there has been a lot of debate about whether the resource-based theory was tautological or not, and probably Jay will elaborate on that. I think it's actually more than a theory. It's a fundamental way of seeing the firm, seeing as in Wittgenstein's sense. And in this sense, resource-based view is perhaps more fundamental than resource-based theory, but Jay will tell us about that. It is for this reason that management as a scientific discipline owes so much to Jay Barney, and this award is for us a way of thanking him for that. May I add something? Jay is another source of admiration for me because his biography indicates that he has 12 grandchildren. So in terms of theoretical contributions and in terms of the number of grandchildren, I only have 2. I feel pretty small next to Jay Barney, so I prefer to let him speak. You know that you can ask questions on the right part of your screen. You have this Q&A function. And so, Jay, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Actually, I now have 13 grandchildren. He just had another little boy. So I think we're probably done. I only have 3 children, but they've been prolific. So that's been. It turns out the best reason to have children is to have grandchildren. Children are pretty much a net cost, but grandchildren, it's all positive, it's all good stuff. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and let's see, there we go. And so what I want to do today is, I was asked to share my personal journey in terms of my intellectual development of resource-based theory. So I'm going to talk about how what my experience was in the early 1980s as I was putting these ideas together. And I'm going to point to a lot of people who had a big influence on my thinking. I want to make it clear, though, that this is just my journey. I don't pretend that my journey is generalizable, but there are other people who were also involved. I'll mention some of them. And each of them had their own intellectual journeys as well. So, but I'm not going to talk a lot about them since I'm going to talk about my personal journey, and hopefully they'll have a chance sometime to talk about their own personal research and journey and how they got to where they are. So with that in background, I actually have to start this discussion back in 1978, which demonstrates how old I really am. I was a PhD student, I had joined the sociology PhD program at Yale in 1976, and I took all my research methods and similar classes, statistical classes, in the PhD program in sociology. And then it came time for me to choose a substantive area to focus on in sociology to prepare for the qualifying exams. And it turns out that particular semester, there was not anything going on in sociology that was particularly interesting to me. And so what I did was I went literally across the street to the School of Organization and Management. It used to be right across the street from the sociology department at Yale. And I took a class from Bob Miles, who was a professor at Yale at that time, in organization theory. And so organizations became sort of the organization and management theory became sort of my substantive area. So when I took my qualifying exams, I took qualifying exams both for the sociology department and for the School of Organization and Management, and ended up with a joint degree in the two. My primary area in sociology was actually mathematical sociology, which was especially with respect to social network theory, and then organization theory on the business school side of things. So these were 3.5 or 4 days of exams. I don't remember exactly anymore. And I answered a bunch of questions, but it was a very important learning experience for me. In terms of mathematical sociology, I actually had been trained by Professor Scott Borman in social network theory and methods, and which was actually very well versed in the field. I concluded that, with a few exceptions, Mark Graneberg being one of those critical exceptions at the time, with few exceptions, this work was largely atheoretical and mostly descriptive in nature. And I was always someone who had been interested in theory and theory development, so this was a bit frustrating for me. And I figured that out after 2 days of writing about research methods and various things. Then now on the organization theory side, even though I had taken the seminar, 2 seminars and had, well, 3 or 4 seminars, if I can't some more of the micro-oriented stuff I took. I was also not terribly impressed with the overall theoretical development in organization management theory. Remember, this was 1978. If you think about the history of the field, in 1978, there were basically 2 approaches, theoretical approaches in management theory. One, the more established, was Pfeffer and Solenzic's work. Those are old pictures of Pfeffer and Solenzic. I thought they were pretty classic. On resource dependence theory, and I was not really taken by resource dependence theory. I thought it was a pretty simple and pretty intuitive. Population ecology work, Hannon's Humans paper in particular, had just been published in that time period. It was actually not included in my reading list to prepare for my qualifying exams. I was always a great admirer of population ecology, or became a great admirer of population ecology. In fact, I think if it had come out a few years earlier in my PhD program, I probably would have adopted a population ecology perspective in my dissertation because of its, because I thought at the time it's probably the theoretically most rigorous and interesting theory out there. That was probably about it. I'm not talking about the micro organizational behavior stuff. There's a well-established literature in that area. This is more macro organization theory, sort of the sociology of organizations. And overall, I found the theories to be pretty simple, pretty intuitive, something I could understand, explain to someone very easily. And I was looking for something more challenging, something that forced me to think about organizations in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And so, that's what I learned from my exams. I passed. I had the oral part of the defense and those things. I passed fine, but was a bit discouraging about to enter my career in studying organizations, not being very convinced that I had a interesting theoretical frame with which I could address these issues. Then a very pivotal event occurred in my career. Bill Ochi, who at the time was a professor at Stanford, was on the job market actually, and came and spoke at Yale. A lot of people don't know Bill anymore. He's I think formally retired now, but he wrote some very influential work in the early 80s. And if you know him, he's actually extremely articulate and very well spoken and very precise in his language, and just the opposite of me in many ways. And he presented an early version of a paper that was ultimately published in ASQ called Markets, Bureaucracies, and Plans. Markets, Bureaucracies, and Plans is a landmark paper in many ways. It's the first effort by a management theorist to try to take insights from organizational economics generally, and specifically Williamson's transaction cost economics, and apply it in a more managerial context. That's what I was talking about. So here's this very articulate fellow explaining, using a language I'd never heard before, and it was great news. I had no idea what he was talking about. No idea. And it wasn't because he wasn't clear. I mean, he was very clear. I still didn't understand what he was talking about. And that, of course, is good news for me, because up to this point, most of the work I had seen, theoretical work I'd seen, it's pretty intuitively obvious, pretty straightforward. So after the talk, I went up to Bill and I said, what else should I read to help understand your perspective? And he told me that I should read Oliver Williamson's books, Markets and Hierarchies. So I went to a library, which we had back then, a real library, and I got Markets and Hierarchies by Oliver Williamson, and it was more confusing than Professor Ochi's talk. I remember in Markets and Hierarchies, there's an introductory chapter about 7-8 pages long, and there's this preamble of this language that he's using, and to me it was a foreign language. I really had no idea what he was talking about. And then he says, I'll give you 3 examples of applying transaction cost logic in this context. And so I had those 3 examples. He had those 3 examples. And I thought, well, I'll be able to work through the examples. I can at least understand the examples. The examples were unclear. But again, that was all really good news to me, because there was clearly a way of thinking about the world that was new and different than me. And these are obviously smart people who were using this language, using this way of thinking about the world that I didn't understand. So I had something to learn, and it was going to be non-intuitive, simple. And so that was exciting for me. I finished my dissertation. This is me. I know in 1980, it's hard to believe it's true. My dissertation was in social network theory, or social networks, again, not much theory, where I demonstrated conclusively that I could run the computer, but I don't think I really learned much about organizations. I was fortunate that I was, President Bill Ochi moved from Stanford to UCLA, and I was fortunate to be able to get a position at UCLA. So I was a newly minted PhD student. I had limited background in strategy, limited background in economics, dissertation on social networks. But I had this sense that there might be a new and interesting way of thinking about organizations that involve organizational economics, institutional economics, and those kinds of things. So I moved to UCLA to Los Angeles in 1980 from Connecticut, New Haven. Before I actually started on the faculty there in the fall of 1980, Bill Ochi organized a conference on, I don't remember the exact title of the conference. It was either the New Institutional Economics or something like that. And because I was starting in the fall, he invited me to come, and so I flew out there. and I went to this conference in spring of 1980. I had no idea that how pivotal this conference would be in my academic career either. Because it turned out that the list of people who were at that conference who presented and was pretty phenomenal. There was, of course, Bill Ochi. Dick Hermelt was on the faculty at UCLA. Bill McKelvey was there as well. Oliver Williamson had just moved to Berkeley. David Teets was at Berkeley or Stanford. I can't remember which right now. And then there were a series of economists, three of them that were at UCLA in the economics department. Armin Alchin, Harold Demsetz, and Ben Klein. If for those of you who know the sort of the background and evolution of institutional economics more generally, you can't get a much better group, a more powerful, more influential, interesting group than this group. And I basically sat at their feet and listened for 2.5 or 3 days, whatever it was. And in the listening, learned an enormous amount about institutional economics and its way of thinking about the world and about organizations in particular. And that all became important background for me. I came back to Yale and shared with my dissertation advisor, John Kimberly. I said, I think that I'm now more convinced than ever that this new institutional economics is a really interesting way to think about organizations. And he assured me that that was not going to be true, that it was still going to be mostly a sociology thing rather than an economic thing. In some ways, John was right, of course, because what's interesting about what we've done with institutional economics and the management side is to bring, in some ways, economics and sociology together in some ways that I think it can be informative. So then I showed up and I learned that from this conference that this new institutional economics was a powerful set of tools for thinking about organizations that I didn't know anything about. That UCLA turns out to be a hotspot for this kind of thinking about the world, and that I clearly needed to upgrade my economics training when I arrived. So I arrived and I was a brand new assistant professor, and so I bought a couple of microeconomics textbooks. I basically taught myself economics, microeconomics. I hung out with smart, economically oriented colleagues. Dick Hermelt's office was actually 2 doors down from mine. And I always said that I gave Dick the highest compliment that I can give any faculty colleague, which is that I never went into his office where I didn't learn something. And so I learned a lot from Dick and from Bill. Bill Ochi at the time had just published a best-selling book called Theory Z. So a new way of thinking about management that actually was quite influential. And so he also took me along on consulting projects. So not only was this a purely theoretical, abstract education, but it was also a very practical education on how you could take these ideas and actually put them to work in organizations. One thing I did that was pretty bold in retrospect was I went to a guy named Tom Copeland. Tom was at the time a professor in finance. He left academia and worked for many years at McKinsey and Booz Allen, I think. In any case, Tom was a very, very bright finance fellow. He had written the sort of really good textbook on the sort of advanced textbook on the theory of finance with a colleague Weston, Copeland Weston. In any case, I went to his office and I knocked on his door and I said, "Hey, I'm Jay Barney. I'm a new organizations person. Is there anything in finance I should read?" He said, "Oh yeah, absolutely. You should read Jensen and Meckling, 1976." Remember, this is a long time ago. This is 1981 when this happened. So, and Jensen and Meckling was not widely read among management scholars at the time. And so Jensen Meckling's paper is the agency theory, is theory of the firm agency costs paper. So I got a copy of the paper and I read Jensen Meckling very quickly because I thought it was going to be some of those kind of intuitive theories that I had understood so quickly in sociology. So I just read it quickly. I took my understanding of that from that quick read back to Professor Copeland. And I said, this is what I think their paper's about. He said, nope, you don't understand the paper yet. I said, okay. So I figured I had one more shot. So I actually spent the next 6 weeks reading Jensen and Meckling's paper. The reason it took 6 weeks is that, especially in the first third of the paper, each sentence in the paper implied a literature I didn't know very much about or anything about. So I would have to I'd read a sentence, then go read this other literature that was implied by that sentence, and read the next sentence and read that again. And I did this over a 6-week period. And after that, I went back to Professor Copeland. I said, here's what Jensen and Meckling is saying. And he said, yep, you understand the argument. So I actually, that was another transformational experience for me. Now, what was interesting, obviously, the main point of the Jensen and Meckling article is all about agency theory, the potential conflict that exists between shareholders and managers and how they like to see a firm managed. I found that interesting, and I've used agency theory at various times in my career. But that's not those were not the central features of the story that were most impactful for me. The two that were most impactful were the use of efficient capital market theory and the value of equilibrium analysis. So efficient capital market theory, I mean, there's a lot of debate about whether capital markets are efficient or not. Those are empirical questions. But as a theoretical matter, efficient capital markets, especially in their semi-strong form, all they assert is that in equilibrium, prices of assets will reflect all publicly available information about the value of those assets. It actually was an extremely powerful assumption for me, because if I make the assumption that capital markets and other kinds of factor markets ultimately are efficient in this sense, then it's going to be kind of hard to fool, kind of hard to cheat these markets in understanding sources of competitive advantage. And so efficient capital markets puts a theoretical constraint in place for strategy theorists that was not there, at least for me, prior to that insight. And then, as a sort of trained sociologist, I was very skeptical about the whole concept of equilibrium analysis, because no system is ever in equilibrium. So why would we ever study a system? Why would we ever approach the study of organizations that are using equilibrium analysis when organizations are never in equilibrium? But of course, the reason you study equilibria is not because they exist, but because that's the way you actually study dynamics, is you understand what the equilibrium, what the system is moving towards, and you look where it is, and that way you can actually make statements about where it's likely to be and how it's likely to evolve. And so I learned a lot about that from that article as well. At this time, I had started teaching at my teaching career at UCLA, teaching a class in organization theory. And then we needed someone to teach strategy classes. I had actually never had a strategy class in my PhD program. Strategy was in the late 1970s was not as well it was even less well developed in organization management theory, and there were certainly no strategy scholars at Yale where I got my PhD. There was a strategy class in the MBA program, but it was taught by a consultant, and I sat in on some of the class, and I thought it was well, the guy was an incredibly good presenter. I thought the content was, shall we say, fast and loose. So I taught in 1993. I began teaching this class in the MBA program in strategy. The first time I went through, I just taught the cases. I just led case discussions, and it was largely an theoretical discussion. And it went well enough, but second time through, I thought before I teach this class, I probably should read the leading scholars in the area. And so I read Michael Porter's book, Competitive Strategy. I still have it up here. It's copies in my library, the one I read. And I hated it. I mean, I really had a very negative reaction. I talked to Mike about this, said so. He gets a kick out of it. But I had a really negative reaction. And I even read the stuff I wrote on the margins and like, what is this guy talking about? This makes no sense. I just disagree. But I didn't actually know why I had such a negative reaction to it. I mean, it was a visceral sort of, I'm not going to teach this. This is wrong. In retrospect, what I would say is I do not feel comfortable teaching a bunch of MBA students how to become monopolists. I'm not much of an economist, but even I know that's not good for society. Come on, if strategy is all about creating monopolies, then I'm not interested in actually contributing to that field. So anyway, I had a very, very negative response to the whole thing. I think I understand now why I did. But let me also qualify this. In my name response, I don't want to, in any sense, do I want to diminish the impact of Porter's work. In fact, I was asked a few years ago to write a retrospective for the Academy of Management Executive, I think, on the impact of Porter's work in the field of strategy. Before Porter, strategic management was systems thinking, goal setting, largely descriptive work on general management, mostly oriented towards teaching, not research. I actually have a copy of the Academy of Management Proceedings from 1978. And if you look at the Business Policy and Planning Division, that's what it's called in that time period, BPP. There were 10 articles that were published as best paper articles for BPP. 5 of them were on pedagogy, how to integrate data into teaching, how to use cases more effectively. The other 5 were on topics that we would be familiar with, but half the program, if that's an estimate of the program, half the program was about teaching, not about research. Don Hamrick reminded me in a session we were together at a few years ago that this is a quote from him, in the late 1970s, it wasn't clear if the field of strategic management would even survive, let alone become a major research area at business schools. I mean, we just did not have a theoretical rigor. We didn't to compete with finance and organizational behavior. Those are the 2 dominant areas. And so what Mike brought to the table was he brought an economic approach to the table for teaching and doing research in strategic management. So why the negative reaction? Because clearly it's a very important, very influential book. Well, my response was I didn't like the economics he brought to the table. So as Hervé mentioned, what Porter did is he brought the structure, conduct, performance perspective or paradigm to the table to analyze industry attractiveness. I think this is well understood that SCP had been developed by Joe Bain in the late 1950s. Its original purpose was to identify industries that were characterized, that had a structure that made them likely that they were engaging, firms in the industry were engaging in monopoly profits. Engaging in monopoly, therefore generating monopoly profits. And then what Mike did is he turned that upside down and he said, we're not going to look for these industries to identify them so we can come up with competitive remedies, but rather these are places where firms can actually make money because they're operating in monopolies or oligopolies. The problem I was having with this application is that the SCP logic as applied in strategy is actually inconsistent with both capital market theory and did not employ equilibrium analysis. The things I had taught myself by reading the Jensen and Meckling article did not apply very well in the SCP framework. And so, in other words, I had become a Chicago School economist, and I didn't even know that. And so I had reacted very badly to the SCP arguments. So in an effort to understand why I had reacted so badly, here's another example of this. Here's an obviously very smart guy who writes this book that is very influential in the field and in practice. Everyone knows Porter's work, the 5 forces and those things. And I'm the weirdo. I'm the one who says this book is terrible. I have a very negative reaction. So to understand my this negative reaction, I actually wrote 2 papers. They were autobiographical in some sense, trying to explain my response. The first one I titled "Why Michael Porter is Wrong." Only an assistant professor has the kind of arrogance to that kind of title. I changed the title quickly. And the second one was "Doing Strategy from the Inside Out." That was the second one I wrote. These 2 papers were written in 1984. So the year after I read Porter's book, basically. This was the core argument that was presented in these 2 papers. Factor markets, that's the markets where firms gain access to the resources they use to implement their product market strategies, can be efficient. This is capital market efficiency generalized to all kinds of factors of production. When factor markets are efficient, acquiring access to resources will not be a source of economic profits, even if they are used to create imperfectly competitive product markets. Therefore, to generate profits, firms must use rare and concentrated resources they already control to gain access to what for them are going to be underpriced resources in factor markets. A firm's resources and capabilities are likely to be cost imitate when they're socially complex, path dependent, or causally ambiguous. And therefore, the empirical assertion is that firms with socially complex, path dependent, or causally ambiguous resources that can be leveraged in acquiring access to new resources can generate economic profits in doing so. That, by the way, just to speak to something, is not a tautology. That's an empirically difficult to test, but it is an empirical assertion. The tautology arguments are actually not very compelling. So to make that sort of logic a little clear, consider this really simple example. I have 3 firms that I've cleverly titled A, B, and C, and they're all competing to get access to a resource, this asset, that is worth as a standalone asset $10,000, which is present value, whatever. And I'm going to assume that all of these 3 firms bring some resources and capabilities to the table such that when they acquire this asset, it can take its value from $10,000 and they can actually make it worth $12,000. So they have $2,000 of synergy of some sort. But because there are 3 firms competing in this market, factor market at the same time, the price for this asset in this auction will rise quickly to equal $12,000, assuming capital markets are efficient. That's because any bid less than $12,000 represents an opportunity to earn economic profit. So there'll be firms will continue to bid up to $12,000. At $12,000 asset price, whoever gets the access to the asset, A, B, or C, what happens is they get an asset that's worth $12,000, and they paid $12,000 for it. So 12,000 minus 12,000, that's a 0 economic profit. Just to make this concrete, suppose you wanted an asset to create an imperfectly competitive product market. The competition for that asset would anticipate the value that would be created in the product market. And therefore, even if you were successful at creating a product market imperfection, competitive imperfection, you would still not generate an economic profit. That's why Michael Porter is wrong. So how do you actually generate economic profits then? Well, what you have to do is that access to that asset has to be worth more to you than anyone else, worth $17,000 to you, $12,000 to everyone else. Why is it worth more? Because you have resources and capabilities that are leverageable, that are rare. If all firms had $17,000, then there would be no profit. So it's got to be rare, and it has to be costly to imitate, because if it was not costly to imitate, firm B and C would do what was necessary to make it so that when they acquired access to the asset, it would also be worth $17,000. So in that world, the asset owner earns $2,000 profit, and firm A earns $5,000 profit, because the price at which this asset trades, access to the asset trade, would be $12,000 and a little bit. So that's the basic resource-based story. Okay. So why Michael Porter is wrong evolved dramatically and was ultimately published in 1986. I wrote it in 1984, it was published in 1986 under the title Strategic Factor Markets, Expectations, Luck, and Business Strategy. And the paper Doing Strategy from the Inside Out ultimately became Firm Resources and Sustained Competitive Advantage, that was published in the Journal of Management in 1991. I wrote the paper in 1984. It was published in 1991. Let me tell you about the challenges associated with this. By the way, these papers have both done very well. The Strategic Factor Market paper has about 9,000 Google sites, and the Journal of Management paper has over 72,000 sites. So let me talk about getting these two papers published, because I hope you see that I've done the background work, Jensen and Meckling. I've done I have intellectual mentors, Meld and Delochi and Bill McKelvey. I have all these things are coming together. I've written these two papers. I'm going to submit them. It's going to work wonderfully, right? So I submitted the Strategic Factor Markets paper to Management Science. Ari Lewin was the associate editor. I got 3 reviews in the first round. The first reviewer said there's nothing new here. The second reviewer said it's too theoretical for strategy research. Well, it is supposed to be theoretical as a theory. And then the third reviewer said this is the most important paper I've read in 10 years. That paper went through 5 rounds of review with Ari Lewin, and none of the reviewers changed their minds. They would say, it's now much clearer that there's nothing new here. It's much clearer that it's too theoretical. And the third reviewer, I had no idea this paper could get better, but it's even more important now. So they all just reinforced their original positions. And despite that, Ari Lewin, acting as an editor as opposed to an accountant, accepted the paper. It was enormously difficult to get this through 5 rounds of revision in a relatively short period of time. So I was very excited, and this paper was published, and then absolutely nothing happened. It was just like this giant theoretical thud. The field of strategy was so dominated by the Porter framework at that point. PhD students were doing strategic groups studies. I remember one doctoral seminar, doctoral consortium I went to, and the person who was leading the session said, how many people here are doing dissertations on strategic groups? And like 18 to 20 people raised their hands. So geez, totally dominated, and no one cared or thought at all about strategic factor markets. The second paper, the 1991 paper, which has become sort of the go-to site for resource-based theory, has an even more convoluted path to being accepted and published. I submitted to AMR. Ironically, I just finished being the editor of AMR, and it was rejected summarily. I revised it and submitted to SMJ. It was rejected. I revised it and submitted it to the Academy of Management meetings, where there's a 50% acceptance rate, and it was rejected. It's too theoretical for AMR, apparently. I submitted a fundamentally new version of the paper to AMR. It was rejected. Same thing, another revision, and this was over 6 or 7 years. Okay, rejected again at the Academy of Management. And then I was asked to become the associate editor of Journal of Management. And one of the first things I did was propose a special issue on resource-based theory. And after going through another review process, the paper was finally published in the special issue of the Journal of Management. I wrote the paper in 1984. It was published in 1991. So one of my own retrospective thinking about my own career is that getting these 2 papers published were actually very close calls. It required persistence on my part to the point of masochism. Really good colleagues who didn't let me give up, and more than a little luck. To get Ari Lewin, for example, I just happened to get lucky on that, and he was very important in the development of the factor markets paper, and then indirectly by the other paper as well. It turns out that those 2 papers, that simplified set of ideas that I presented to you with those little arrows and 17,000 versus the 12,000, turned out to have pretty broad implications. And these are all papers that I have written and published that build on those simple ideas. And you can look for those themselves. It is the case. I just published a paper at SMJ in 2018 titled "Why Resource-Based Theories Model of Profit Appropriation Must Take a Stakeholder Perspective." In a real sense, that SMJ 2018 paper is just me finally understanding all the implications, or at least most of the implications, of my 1986 management science paper on strategic factor markets. It took me that long to understand the paper I had actually written and what it really meant for stakeholders. Altogether, these papers have been cited over 175,000 times, which I even find to be amazing. I wanted also just to talk about some of the, I mentioned them before, but I think there's some really important, other important papers and people that were part of my evolution of these ideas. One of the mistakes that I made as an assistant professor was I sort of operated with the assumption that publishing was a zero-sum game, that if someone else published, then I wouldn't be able to be published, that there's some sort of fixed amount of space in the journals. It's the same way that and so most of my early papers were sort of, I was not particularly collaborative. I was doing the work all by myself. But I think it's very important to say that, to recognize that I was not, there were still critical colleagues of mine that were very, very important. Bill McKelvey, who again has since retired, was a colleague of mine at UCLA. Bill, I remember the day he walked down the hall, knocked on my door. My door was closed in my office. And he said, "Yeah, I just read these 2 papers. Those are the 2 papers I wrote in 1984. And he said, they're really good. This is really important stuff." It's the first positive feedback I'd received on those 2 papers. And given how long and how difficult it was to get them published, I relied on Bill McKelvey's positive feedback. Bill McKelvey didn't like anything. So if you like these 2 papers, they must be pretty good. If he was here, he would laugh and agree that he never liked anything, but he liked those 2 papers. And he gave me that feedback. Dick Ramelt and Robin Wensley in 1981, they published a paper called "In Search of the Market Share Effect." It was only published as in the best paper proceedings of the Academy of Management, of the BPP division in 1981. And it hinted at, in a really important way, the fact that you could generalize the concept of efficient capital markets to other kinds of factors of production. They were actually looking at market share. At the time, some of you may know, there had been a series of articles, some in academic journals, some in the Harvard Business Review, based on the PIMS database that showed that cross-sectionally, market share was how they correlated with profitability. And so the story was the key to profitability is acquiring market share. But what Rommel and Wensley did was they showed that if the market for market share is competitive, then acquiring market share won't be a source of profit. That's very much that's my language for describing their result, but it was very consistent with the result. It was a very influential. Again, not published in a major journal. There are some challenges with the data, I guess, but the story was very powerful. In 1973, Harold Dumez wrote a very short article in the Journal of Law and Economics called Industry Structure, Market Reality, and Public Policy, where he basically argued that, that up to that point, if a firm was earning economic profits, that was prima facie evidence that it was engaging in anti-competitive behavior. And Dumez said that that wasn't true, that sometimes firms, there's a line in the sentence in the paper that goes something like, sometimes firms earn economic profits because they address customer needs more effectively. So just a throwaway line, but it actually is the essence of resource-based theory at its core. There were two conferences that were organized by assistant professors at the Wharton School of Business on the New Jersey shore that were also very important for me. They rented two big houses on the Jersey shore, just directly west of Philadelphia, east of Philadelphia, excuse me. And it was a bunch of assistant professors. We didn't know anything, which was wonderful. There were no formal paper presentations, just people would start a conversation and then the room would sort of blow up and there would be conversation. That was the first place that I presented to an academic audience, the 1991, what became the 1991 paper. And it was extremely important because, at least the way I perceived it, I happened to be the first speaker the first morning. And that logic of valuable, rare, custom retained, non-substitutable, that logic had an impact on the rest of the meeting. And so I thought that this has legs. After that meeting, I came home and was talking to my wife. I said, you know, this could work out okay. I still get the papers published, but it could work out okay. In 1989, there was a Strategic Management Society meeting in San Francisco. We had a special, we had a panel, and on that panel, David Teese was on the panel. He presented a paper that later became Dynamic Capabilities. It was 4 or 5 people presented papers that later became very influential in the evolution of resource-based theory. I was part of that. Ricky Griffin, who was the editor, he's an OB scholar at Texas A&M, was the editor of the Journal of Management. And when I asked him if I could put together a special issue on resource-based theory, I think he thought I was talking about resource dependence theory. It didn't matter. He was very supportive. The other thing that was interesting is all during this time, I'm also working with companies, initially applying mostly transaction cost economics to vertical integration questions. But ultimately, it gave me a chance to really explore with some really smart, hardworking, thoughtful executives what became sort of resource-based theory. Because it turns out not only is this a theory theoretically interesting, at least I think, but it's also it also informs the way you think about managing to gain competitive advantage in a very practical way, which I'm happy to talk about if you'd like to. There were other events that were happening. So first, the new institutional economics and field strategic management began to merge. now I can go to conferences. I remember the first conference I went to where I presented an agency theory paper. Oh, sorry, it's a transaction cost paper. And someone in the back of the room raises their hand and says, "It's all very good, Professor Barney, but how do you measure transaction costs?" Well, it turns out, of course, that's exactly the wrong question to ask. Because if you could actually measure transaction costs easily, they wouldn't be transaction costs, would they? Instead, but I didn't have a good answer to that question. That became less difficult over time. Berger Vernerfeld, of course, publishes a paper in SMJ called The Resource-Based View, where the name came from. His logic was a dualism logic, which is, you can have competitive imperfections in product markets, but you can also have them in resource markets. He didn't use the factor market language. Dick Ramel had a paper in his book chapter. See, a lot of these are pretty obscure. There's a book chapter, and that's where he talked about barriers to invitation as an analog to barriers to entry. It's a good paper. Alpha Castanedas and Kate Connor, and later Kate Ramel, they got married. Connie and Richards, these were papers that were published in the special issue of the Journal of Management. Connie and Richard actually anticipated my own work on stakeholder theory by many years, because what they did is they observed that if managers were treated as residual claimants, then that would reduce agency costs. So the paper was primarily positioned as an agency theory paper, but it focused on managerial capabilities, and thus was very influential. Kate, who was also a former doctoral student of mine at UCLA, wrote this really brilliant paper that sort of put resource-based logic within the broader framework and structure of microeconomic theory. In fact, most of what I know about the intellectual roots of resource-based theory actually come from working with Kate on her paper, and so that was a great source of information. Margie Pederoff has a paper in 1988 in SMJ that was extremely influential and impactful for me, and it was on the 4 cornerstones of competitive advantage. Joe Mahoney is the scholar that linked for me resource-based theory with Edith Penrose. This is ironic since this presentation sort of emerged out of the Penrose Award that I won last year. It was a great honor. I met Edith once. If I have time, I'll talk about that story. But I actually did not know anything about Penrose until after these papers had been written and published. And then Joe Mahoney said, "You should read Edith Penrose." I did not. I came to resource-based theory in a bizarre way through agency theory, efficient capital markets, and Chicago School of Economics. And Edith came in a completely different direction, but we ended up in very similar places. And then, of course, Keith Conant and Schuman's paper on dynamic capabilities. David actually wrote the dynamic capabilities paper. I don't know if Gary and Amy were with him at that point as co-authors, but he actually wrote the dynamic capabilities paper for the special issue at Journal of Management, but he didn't get the revision back to me in time, and so we couldn't publish it there. I would have loved to have published it, of course. That would. So a couple of, so I point this out again to show that while writing papers, theory papers especially, can be a pretty lonely experience, it would be inappropriate to think that you actually ever really do that. That this is a social process, and even though these people, Joe and Margie and David and Berger and Richard and Connie and Kate, even though I think I actually have written one paper with Margie, and that's all. but these people were all very, very deeply influential on my thinking and on the evolution of resource-based theory. Since these papers were published, things have continued to go well. I think resource-based theory became sort of so we start with positioning models in the early 1980s, and then late 1980s, early 1990s, resource-based theory became sort of the dominant perspective, both for theory and practice in strategic management. Not that we abandoned the positioning stuff; we still use that where appropriate. But, and then finally, and then we've moved into a world now where those two theories are now augmented by theories that deal with uncertainty, entrepreneurship, and real options logic seems to also have sort of emerged. So, and now I think, and this is just me talking, I think the field of strategy may be shifting, too early to tell, but maybe shifting towards taking stakeholder perspectives more seriously. This is something in my own work, and so that our thinking continues to evolve. I remember saying sometime as an assistant professor, if I'm 65 years old and worrying about getting my next paper published in AMR, then something's wrong. Well, I'm now 66 years old. I still like getting papers published in AMR. But the thing that has been fun, the thing that I did not anticipate is how this intellectual journey has never really ended. It began in many ways when I attended a research seminar by Bill Ochi and didn't understand what he was talking about. And now, many, many years later, actually 40 years later, I'm still trying to understand the implications of this way of thinking about the world, both for theory and for practice. So thank you. And now I think I'm open for questions if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Shay. There's a question by Anna Grandoi. Do you see it?
Oh, do I see it? Where do I see it?
The link between the quasi-monopolist Vrin.
Isn't taking a viewpoint left.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Oh, I got it now. Okay. Oh yeah, great question. Great question. I wrote a book chapter on this recently, a while ago. So the question is the following. So the welfare economics suggests that the best way for firms, for social welfare to be maximized is for markets to be perfectly competitive. And one way of understanding how resource-based theory and other theories in strategic management were created is that they, one by one, they relax one of the critical assumptions of welfare, the general welfare theory. So, for example, transaction cost eliminates the assumption that there are zero transaction costs. Agency theory eliminates the assumption that managers do exactly what shareholders want them to do. And resource-based theory eliminates the assumption that factors of production are mobile and can be moved around at low cost. It turns out one of the assumptions of the welfare economics is that, this is the work that Ken Arrow did many decades ago, is that there's large numbers of competing firms and that firms are homogeneous with respect to resources and capabilities. Now, if it turns out that there's a monopoly or oligopoly, or a closely cooperating oligopoly, then there's something that's creating economics called the dead weight loss. And it's clearly not good for social welfare. But it doesn't turn out, it turns out that eliminating some of the assumptions in the standard theory doesn't actually create social welfare problems. This was actually the major impact of this work. This work was actually done by Harold Demsetz He said, if a firm earns economic profits because it's operating in a competitive setting, but it has skills and capabilities that not every area of a firm has, that enable it to more efficiently address the preferences of consumers, then that's actually completely consistent with social welfare. So one of the things I liked about resource-based theory in retrospect is that resource-based theory is a theory of competitive advantage of economic profits that is consistent with social welfare, because we're not making assumptions of monopoly or oligopoly. We're not making assumptions about barriers to entry. We're not making any assumption about the use of market power. Now, in order to generate profits, the way to generate profits is you address customer needs more efficiently than anyone else. That's good for consumers. That's good for the firm, and that's the source of economic profits. Now, it can be the case. There's a link between resource-based logic and oligopoly theory that has not been really developed too much in the literature, which would sort of goes like, we start out being more effective in addressing customer needs. That increases our market share. We increase our market share, erect barriers to entry, we become monopolists. So that there could be an evolution of efficiency-seeking economic profits turning into monopoly profits at some point. I'll grant that possibility. But I think, in fact, resource-based theory can be consistent with social welfare. And that's one of the problems I had with Porter's work, which was that I really wasn't interested in teaching MBA students how to become monopolists. Didn't think that was going to be the good thing to do in the long run. Helping them learn how to identify and then take advantage of their ability to uniquely address consumer needs. Now that didn't sound so problematic.
Following, there are other questions, but following on Anna's question, can a link be drawn between resource-based theory and co-opetition?
Co-opetition? So co-opetition, the answer is probably yes, but it would have to be in the following way. So co-opetition means a couple things, and so let me clarify what I'm thinking about. So there has been a evolution in the field of strategy over the last 5 or 8 years, where there's been a recognition that our unit of analysis has to change somewhat. It used to be that the unit of analysis was the industry, that was 5 forces and things. Then the unit of analysis became the firm, and then moved quickly to the unit of analysis with the resource or capability that was inside or controlled by a firm. But this work on ecosystems and network industries and platforms and those kinds of things make it clear that resources don't have to be owned and inside the boundary of the firm in order to be relevant for analyzing how resources can be sources of economic profits. So to the extent that co-opetition refers to the ability that some firms have to induce stakeholders of various kinds to make specific investments in a firm that can become co-specialized, that's where I think the co-opetition kind of story comes into play. Then that's actually the stakeholder resource-based theory stuff that I've done recently in SMJ. And I think co-opetition, and then a firm's differential ability to do that then becomes the source of economic profits. I think to me, the critical first observation is that you don't have to own the resources in order for them to be potentially sources of economic profit. What you have to do is you have to be able to induce stakeholders of various kinds to make these specific investments in this bundle of resources that you're trying to create and the manager or entrepreneur is trying to create. And that logic then leads to one of my main conclusions in the SMJ paper from 2018 is that resource-based theories model of profit generation, this creation of co-specialized resources inside a firm, necessarily implies that its theory of profit appropriation has to take a stakeholder perspective. It has to include the fact that stakeholders besides shareholders can be sources, can be residual claimants, and thus be sources of economic profit. And co-opetition seems to fit in that. One way of thinking about co-opetition seems to fit nicely into this kind of space.
Okay, thank you. So another question. In your talk, you mentioned practical contributions.
Sure, sure.
Can you give some precision?
Sure, I'd like to. I'd be happy to share that. Yeah, it's really interesting. Turns out, in my experience, that CEOs and other senior managers are systematically bad at identifying their sources of sustained competitive advantage. I've speculated, not in print, but I speculate why that might be the case. You know, CEOs, they're managing a current business. They're dealing with customers and suppliers. And they're trying to build a team. I mean, they're doing a lot of stuff, and so often don't have the time or the theoretical lens to sort of think about what their sources of competitive advantage are. And so the first thing I do when I work with companies is I simply ask them, why are you guys successful? And their explanations for success are usually wrong. That is, they're usually inconsistent with resource-based logic. So for example, I did some work years ago with this company and said, why are you guys successful? He said, well, our top management team is phenomenal. We've been working together for 15 years. We understand each other's points of view completely. We complete each other's sentences. We work together. We make good decisions quickly. I said, okay. So in my mind, I said, they check the value box. So tell me about the top management teams of your competitors. Oh, they're really good. Well, they ain't rare. So there's no doubt that your top management team is an important asset for your company, and we want to make sure we don't lose that. But that doesn't explain why you're doing so much better than your competitors, because they have the same kind of thing. I find this to be particularly true for technology-based companies, because sometimes the people who develop these technologies fall in love with the technology, literally fall in love with the technology. And so you ask, well, what makes your company so successful? Or what will make you so successful? Well, it's our technology. It's bigger or smaller or faster or slower or whatever it is. It's really cool. It's all great. Who else has that technology? No one else has that technology. It's valuable and rare. No one else has it. I said, great, that's at least a temporary competitive advantage. I said, how long is it going to take for your competitors to imitate your technology? You know, 6 months. Okay. Let's look elsewhere, because it is almost never the technology that is the source of sustained competitive advantage. It can be the ability to create technology. That's a capability, but it's not just the technology. I make this point in class, and also I've done this with executives around the world. I pretend I own a hot dog stand, and this hot dog stand is very successful. And but I work so close, well, work day to day on the hot dog stand, I really don't know why it's successful. So I asked the class, what makes a hot dog stand successful? And they generate with me this long list of things: the hot dogs themselves, the buns, the sauces, go through the whole long list. And then you apply the VRIO criteria, and basically most of these things are sources of competitive parity. They're important, but they're not special. It's fun. It's a fun exercise to do. Someone will always say marketing, your marketing skills, and I say, oh, you've heard our jingle. I really have the CEO singing a jingle. I help him figure out what the jingle is for the company. But you go through them all, and it turns out there's really only two things that meet the criteria. One of them is I have these special sauces that are based on on a proprietary recipe, and also have a brand around them. So proprietary proprietary recipe is an example of path dependence, and a brand is a socially complex relationship with your customers. So that's potentially a source of sustained competitive advantage. The other is, it's not any one of these things that makes me have a competitive advantage. Instead, I'm doing all of them well, and that's social complexity as a source of sustained competitive advantage. And then I say, so if it's the sauce, how do I grow the business? And then of course you sell the sauce. And if it's doing all these things correctly, how do I grow the business? Well, I open franchises. And my last point is, you can't choose your growth strategy until you know what your source of sustained competitive advantage is. Done. So I think it's very practical in that way. Let me two more real quick comments. First of all, and this really speaks to the social and almost emotional dimensions of strategy. When I go through and systematically show that what firms think is their source of competitive advantage cannot be their source of competitive advantage, that actually is emotionally difficult for CEOs to let go of their theories. And it's, it needs to be embedded. So the process of identifying your actual sources of competitive advantage need to be embedded in an understanding of how these managers, they've committed to technology people. They hold on to that technology as the source of their competitive advantage, like it's a life preserver and they're drowning. I mean, it's the thing. This is why our company was formed, and when we show that that's not likely to be a source of competitive advantage, there's that emotional dimension. That's interesting. The second thing that's interesting is resource-based theory does not provide a rules for riches for these managers. That is, if it did, you know it would be wrong, right? A rules for riches is here's a set of activities you can engage in that will make money for you for sure. You'll generate economic profits for sure. A few years ago, I saw this guy on the internet who was selling a rules for riches. He said, if you come to my seminar, I will teach you the 3 words that are essential. These are the 3 words that have made me wealthy, and there'll be the 3 words. When you learn these 3 words, it will make you wealthy beyond your imagination. Well, you stop the video at that point. You start speculating, what could those 3 words be? One of them was marry a rich spouse. That always works, I think. Divorce rich spouse, I think, would also work. But it turns out that his 3 words are never give up, which is really a disappointment. Because sometimes the best thing to do is to give up. You can't sell, if you sell, that's selling rules for riches, and the only people who make money selling rules for riches are the people who are selling the rules for riches. You can't. So resource-based theory, I don't go to it and say, we're going to go through this process and we will for sure find a way for you to generate economic profit, or explain why you generate economic profit. Resource-based theory is, all it can do is it can eliminate possibilities. It can suggest directions where you might look, but I can't. I've been asked to write this book. I can't ethically. I can't write this book. What are the 10 keys to competitive advantage? If I knew, I wouldn't tell you. I just use them, and I would make a ton of money, right? So I'm not going to write that book. I'm not going to write that article. All I can do is I can say, this is where you should look for sources of competitive advantage. Path dependence, the role of history, social complexity, causal ambiguity, tacit, informal. That's where you look for competitive advantage. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but that's all you can do. So I hope that, I think I found it to be extremely useful. That hot dog experience changes people's lives, bizarrely, from my point of view, but as a teaching pedagogy, it works very, very well.
There's a question on COVID. So the COVID crisis, what is the which resources, in your opinion, are rare and costly to imitate? And more generally, what can the resource-based theory tell us of the crisis and the future?
Sure. Let me talk about operational crises first, and then the pandemic is sort of in that category. Although the pandemic is probably a better way of thinking about the role of uncertainty in business, because I have a lot of clients who I think have very reasonable, high probability success strategies for gaining economic profits based on resource-based logic that were blown up by the pandemic. I mean, seriously, what are you going to do? So resource-based logic it is applicable up to 19 uncertainty constraints. Virtually all theories are that way. So, but there are ways to respond to crises that are derived, that could ultimately generate sources of competitive advantage. Again, you look to the socially complex would be the place I'm thinking about. So I know I have friends who work with companies, to be very precise, friends who work with companies who, when COVID first hit, their solution was to lay off large numbers of people. In the face of uncertainty, they panicked. I'm not criticizing all layoffs in this context. I understand that you can keep people working right to the point where you go out of business, and that doesn't help everyone. I understand those problems. That said,
so we have.
Let me finish this. There are ways to use a crisis to create a sense of community in an organization, as opposed to just cutting people off and moving on. And that creating that culture, those relationships, that sense of trust, that common enemy, that sense of collegiality, that's if you can figure out a way to do that, then you're actually positioning your company to be really successful once COVID goes away. So I would speak to that. As to the questions like global warming and sustainability more generally.
Yeah,
that's really great questions, and I'll be frank. Up until recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, those were not issues that I thought a lot about. The economists call them externalities, and there's a whole externalities have always been a problem for economists. They don't know how to solve them, basically. I mean, their solution is we'll make an externality, we'll internalize an externality. But if you could do that, you would have already done that. So it's not very useful advice very often. But some of the stuff on pricing carbon credits is more interesting, because it actually has that effect. But what my work on stakeholder theory has really convinced me, though, is that so it comes from the following logic. The logic is I need to firms need to assemble resources and capabilities from all their stakeholders, some of which are co-specialized in the way they can generate economic profits. And then the question becomes, once you're actually successful generating economic profits, how then do you allocate those profits among the stakeholders that help you generate them, which is what you have to do, or you won't be able to get the resources in the first place. And what it strikes me that the traditional story has been, well, this is a process of negotiation, and so it's about negotiating skills and bargaining power and this kind of thing. That's probably part of the story. But I'm also convinced that unless there is a sense of fairness and equity, long-term equity and fairness, unless there's a sense among this set of stakeholders that we're united, not just to generate economic profits, but we're united socially, personally, we're also committed to a common set of values, that that those bundles of resources and capabilities from both stakeholders actually are more likely to be a source of sustained competitive advantage, precisely because they are so socially complex and path dependent in character. So I'm currently trying to use that logic to write a paper that first of all articulates a little more completely about how fairness, using a Rawlsian notion of fairness, by the way, justice and fairness are actually an important part of the equilibrium that has to be maintained in order for stakeholders to be willing to gather together to make these specific investments. And then what implications that has for how firms should treat non-residual claimants, because there's still fixed claimants out there. You have to pay an hourly wage and for a plug and play in your company, but you still have moral obligations to those people as well. And we need to think about that much more carefully.
Okay, maybe one question: which critical comment of the RBV was the most difficult to address? To you?
So the tautology critique was difficult to address only because I didn't understand my own theory well enough. But over the years, so the great irony is, over the years, there's been several thousand empirical tests of resource-based theory, some of which turn out to not be consistent with resource-based theory. There are constraints on the theory, obviously. So if it was a tautology, then there wouldn't be all these empirical tests, some of which didn't come out right. So I think over time it's been demonstrated that that's not really an issue. The reason I was not, what I didn't understand about my own theory is I didn't understand what I'm talking about. I should have emphasized more the attributes of resources and capabilities that make them costly to imitate, because those are empirical assertions. In my response, I said this. The critique focused on the first part of the paper, but didn't read the second half of the paper, unfortunately, where the actually empirical work actually, and that's where people have done most of the empirical work. So
maybe we have time left to a short question and a big question.
Okay.
The short one would be the difference between dynamic capabilities and RBV.
So I can turn that into 45 minutes, or I can do it in 45 seconds. Right? So, no, I want to make it absolutely clear. David Teese is a great friend of mine. Designer is a good friend. I know Amy and that as well, but Barry is a good friend, and what they've done is really good. But at a SMS sponsored conference in British Columbia, I made the argument that dynamic capabilities is actually not a new theory of economic profits. Dynamic capabilities are capabilities that are dynamic. That doesn't mean they're unimportant. They're very important to study. But if a group of competing firms all have the same dynamic capabilities, they may be valuable, but they're not rare. Therefore, they will not be a source of competitive advantage or economic profit. So, so the same resource-based logic, same requirements for certain generating economic profit that are derived from strategic factor market theory apply to dynamic capabilities. And Professor Teese said, I never made a claim that dynamic capabilities was a new theory of economic profits. So to me, it's an important special case of resource-based theory.
And so
I have some funny stories to tell about that.
So the last big one question is what perspectives, what important points to be addressed by RBV now and in the future?
Sure, sure. You know, another piece of work that I have done over the last few years with Professor Sharon Alvarez is in entrepreneurship, where we focused on the creation of new opportunities in entrepreneurship. And one of the key insights from that work is that the future isn't out there waiting to be discovered. It's in the process of being created by the people who are watching this presentation, by young people, by scholars around the world, many of whom I don't know, who are doing work that I'm not aware of, that at some point I will become aware of, and I'll say, oh man, I wish I had thought of that. It's not uncommon for me to read papers that build on resource-based logic and respond, boy, I wish I had thought of that. That is so smart, so clever. I wrote the dang paper. Why didn't I think of that? Well, I didn't. Just the way it is. So I'm constantly surprised, amazed, and gratified by that. It's part of what keeps me going as a scholar is that the ability to learn. So rather than trying to predict the future, well-known physicist has said prediction is really hard, especially about the future. So rather than trying to predict the future, all I can tell you is what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And what I'm interested in, what I see my resource-based work going over the next couple of years, is taking stakeholders seriously in resource-based theory and in strategy more generally. And this will be a controversial statement, and we could spend an hour or two on this by itself, but I think current stakeholder theory is not sufficiently specific to allow either prediction, testing, or certainly prescription. For example, the recent statement by the Business Roundtable CEOs, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it by now, that while every corporation has its own purpose, we all agree that we need to address all the interests of our major stakeholders. That is a statement with almost no content, because the interests of all your stakeholders, that's millions of people. Are you kidding me? You're going to satisfy the interests of all those people? That only if those interests are all aligned is that a possible statement. And so we wrote a editorial at AMR that makes this point. Since there will always be conflicts of interest, even within stakeholder groups, not all shareholders are the same. Shareholders and debt holders and consumers and customers and suppliers. I mean, seriously. So the received theory needs more specificity. It needs constraints. It's one thing I try to do in the SMJ paper is to say, not all stakeholders are the same. Some make specific investments that have rent generating capability. Others don't. You don't treat all the stakeholders the same. So understanding what that means for strategy as a field, it's already happening without stakeholder language, like this, I mentioned ecosystem position analysis. I think has real potential, and it has forced me to think about, as I mentioned earlier, things like fairness and equity among those stakeholders that are making specific investments for generating profits. It's a difficult problem, and that's the reason it hasn't been solved yet. But there are some new papers that are coming out that take some of like Eleanor Ostrom's work and apply it in the context of stakeholders that has a lot of potential. I'm working with a philosopher actually who was Rawls's student. She's incredibly smart, so that's why I want to work with her, because I think you learn that way. And so we're trying to see if we can take some Rawlsian logic to help us understand what justice means with respect to stakeholders who are not part of the rent generation process, that is, that are fixed payments, not residual payments. So I think in some sense it is going back to my roots of bringing a more sociological perspective into the economics of profit generation. But I've said this before in print. I've said if you take the economics of competitive advantage seriously, what you discover is the social nature of organizations. They're socially complex, path dependent, causally ambiguous. It's the trust, it's the friendship. Trust and friendship cannot be bought and sold. And so because of that, that's the source of competitive advantage.
Okay, that's a very good conclusion, Jay. So we thank you very, very much congratulations again for the Edith Penrose Award.
Thank you very much.
You deserve it,
I appreciate
no
it.
doubt. And so we close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.